Picture yourself handed command of an army that has just suffered one of the worst defeats in your nation's history. Your men are starving. They have no shoes. Half of them have already vanished into the night. And the enemy controls almost every major city in the region. Now picture spending the next 2 years fighting battle after battle and losing every single one of them. And yet somehow walking away as the man who won the war. That sounds impossible, but it actually happened. And the man who pulled it off has been almost completely forgotten by history. His name was Nathanael Greene, and between 1780 and 1782, he ran one of the most brilliant military campaigns the world has ever seen, without ever winning a major battle. Before we get into how he did it, ask yourself something simple. What if the way you have been taught to measure success your whole life is wrong? What if winning isn't about looking good in the moment, but about what you have left standing when everyone else has burned themselves out? That single idea is the heart of this story, and it starts in the most unlikely place imaginable. Greene was born in 1742 into a Quaker family in Rhode Island, people who believed deeply in peace and refused even to study war. But young Nathanael could not stop himself. He smuggled books on military tactics into his own home, reading about famous generals by candlelight, while his father assumed he was studying scripture. He taught himself geometry just to understand how fortifications and artillery worked. By the time fighting broke out with Britain, he had absorbed more military theory than most trained officers, despite never once standing on a battlefield. He also carried something that should have ended any military career before it began. A limp so pronounced it never left him. In an age when officers were expected to look commanding on horseback, Greene simply did not fit the picture. He was a self-taught bookworm with a bad leg, eventually expelled from his own church for attending a military parade. Yet that same outsider, when war finally came, enlisted not as an officer, but as a private soldier, starting at the very bottom, despite knowing more than most men above him. He did not stay there long. Within months, Rhode Island promoted him to general. And when he marched his troops to join the siege of Boston, George Washington noticed him almost immediately. While other militia units fell apart from poor discipline, Greene's men were organized, clean, and reliable. And Washington saw something rare in him, a man who understood that keeping an army alive mattered just as much as winning a fight. That trust grew into the most important partnership of the entire revolution, and it would be tested again and again in the years that followed. Greene fought at Trenton on that freezing Christmas night in 1776, leading one of Washington's 2 main columns through a blinding snowstorm. He fought at Princeton, at Brandywine, at Germantown, with mixed results and real mistakes along the way, including a costly one at Fort Washington. What set him apart was not perfection. It was how he handled failure. He never made excuses. He studied what went wrong, adjusted, and came back sharper, a habit that would define everything he accomplished later. Then came the job nobody wanted. In the brutal winter of 1778, the Continental Army was collapsing at Valley Forge, starving, freezing, and wrapped in bloody rags where boots should have been. Washington needed someone to become quartermaster general, the officer responsible for feeding and supplying the entire army. And Greene hated the idea because it meant giving up the fight for paperwork. But he understood something most ambitious men miss, that an army without food or shoes is not an army at all. And he took the job because it needed doing, not because it would make him famous. By 1780, the war in the South had become a disaster. The British captured Charleston and took an entire American army prisoner. And when General Horatio Gates tried to fix things, his forces were annihilated at Camden, while he fled on horseback for 3 straight days. Washington did not hesitate this time either. He sent Greene. When Greene arrived in Charlotte that December, he found roughly 1,400 exhausted men, many unpaid for months, in an army that existed in name only, surrounded by a countryside torn apart by years of brutal partisan warfare. Instead of panicking, Greene did something that broke every rule of 18th century warfare. He split his tiny army in half, sending part of it under General Daniel Morgan toward the frontier, while he took the rest in another direction entirely. Everyone said dividing a smaller force in front of a larger enemy was suicide. But Greene understood the terrain and the psychology of the situation better than his critics, because splitting his army forced the British commander Cornwallis to split his own forces too, and that meant he could never bring his full strength against either half. Cornwallis sent his most feared cavalry commander after Morgan, and on January 17, 1781, at a place called Cowpens, Morgan turned and fought using a plan built entirely around expectation and psychology. He placed his weakest troops in front, told them to fire twice and then run, and let the British charge straight into the trap behind them. In under an hour, the British force was wrecked, with over 800 men killed, wounded, or captured. It was one of the most complete tactical victories of the entire war, and it happened because Greene had set the stage. Furious, Cornwallis decided to chase Greene down and destroy him for good, burning his own supply wagons to move faster and betting everything on catching the Americans before they escaped. What followed was one of history's great chases, with Greene's exhausted men marching nearly 200 miles through freezing rain, fording swollen rivers, and collapsing from sheer fatigue at every stop. They crossed the Dan River into Virginia, with the British arriving at the empty riverbank mere hours too late, after burning their own supplies and exhausting their army for absolutely nothing. Here is where Greene revealed his real genius. Most generals would have rested in safety. Greene turned around and marched straight back into North Carolina, gathering reinforcements along the way until he had roughly 4,400 men. He chose his ground at a place called Guilford Courthouse, and on March 15th, 1781, Cornwallis attacked. fighting was savage. And at one desperate point, Cornwallis ordered his own artillery to fire into the chaos, hitting his own men along with the Americans, just to break the assault and hold the field.
Cornwallis technically won that battle, but it cost him more than 500 men, over a quarter of his entire force. And these were irreplaceable British regulars shipped across an ocean at enormous expense. Greene lost more men in raw numbers, but most were militia who would simply reform within weeks. A member of the British Parliament reportedly said that one more victory like that would ruin their entire army. And he was exactly right, because Cornwallis had just won a battle that quietly finished his campaign. Greene never chased Cornwallis to Virginia, because that was not his job. Instead, he turned back to dismantle the British forts still scattered across South Carolina, working alongside legendary partisan fighters like the Swamp Fox and the Gamecock to squeeze the countryside inch by inch. He lost again at Hobkirk's Hill, failed to take the post at 96 after a brutal month-long siege, and lost once more at Eutaw Springs when his own men stopped to loot an abandoned camp. On paper, this was a man who could not win a single fight to save his life.
But look closer, and the real math becomes obvious. Every time Greene lost, he retreated in good order, kept his army intact, and returned stronger within weeks. Every time the British won, they bled soldiers they could never replace and burned through supplies they could not refill, all while holding slightly more hostile ground with a slightly weaker force to defend it. Greene was not trying to win a glorious battle. He was trying to bleed the British dry, one expensive victory at a time. And it worked exactly as he planned.
After Eutaw Springs, the British retreated to Charleston and never came out again, leaving the Carolinas essentially liberated without a single pitched battle won outright. Cornwallis, with nowhere left to go, marched his battered army north into Virginia and straight into the trap waiting for him at a small tobacco port called Yorktown. Washington and the French got the glory for that final siege, but the truth is simple. Cornwallis only ended up at Yorktown because Greene had already closed every other door in the South. Even more remarkable is what came after. Greene had spent his own personal fortune keeping his soldiers fed, personally guaranteeing loans when Congress sent nothing but excuses. And after the war, he was left buried in debt, with creditors chasing him for years. Georgia eventually gave him a plantation near Savannah, and he died there in 1786, at just 43 years old, likely from heat exhaustion, leaving his wife to untangle the financial wreckage he had shouldered for a country too slow to repay him. There is something almost poetic about a man who never won a single major battle, turning out to be one of the most strategically gifted commanders his country ever produced. He proved that a war is not won
by whoever holds the ground when the smoke clears. It is won by whoever understands what actually matters and refuses to lose it, which for Greene was always the survival of his army itself. Ask anyone today to name the generals of the American Revolution, and almost nobody says his name. And maybe after hearing this, it is time that finally changed.